Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Tiffany Events and Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church, we'd like to welcome you to this conversation today. Our Tiffany Events presents high-quality musical programs and important speakers on issues of concern to the Baltimore community and beyond. Over the years, our series has sponsored concerts in a range of musical styles and engaging speakers on diverse topics. The music has included brass, bluegrass, and gospel performances, handbell festivals, and classical concerts, and speakers have spoken on important social justice issues of the day. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. If you need to use a restroom, they're through the doors over here. Feel free to get up, go in, and you'll see the entrance to the restroom there. And you're more than welcome to do that throughout the presentation today. In addition, on your programs, you'll notice there's a QR code. If you're interested in more events coming up, if you want to put your app in for that QR code, you will be notified when our next Tiffany event is. Also, if you'd like to ask any questions, you must use the Slido app, which is also on your program, to list your questions there. And that would be helpful, and we will be monitoring those questions and handing them to our moderator. And then finally, after the conversation, we'll be having a wonderful reception through the doors over here to your left. We have some food and some beverages and an opportunity to talk to Peter directly if you'd like. We will be having some books available to purchase, as well as he will have a period of time where he will sign anybody's books that you'd like to have signed by him. Okay? So welcome all, and we hope you enjoy this afternoon. First, I would like to introduce Reverend Andrew Connors. He's our moderator for today. He brings more than 2 decades of pastoral leadership experience to our church, Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church. For a decade, he served as co-clergy, co-chair of the Baltimoreans United in Leadership. Andrew has served as a moderator of the Presbytery of Baltimore and currently chairs the Presbytery Cabinet. He attended Duke University and also received a BA in History with a focus on contemporary social movements. He holds a Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary. Please welcome Pastor Andrew Connors. And it is our pleasure to introduce Peter Beinert, a Rhodes Scholar with degrees from Yale and Oxford. He's a professor of journalism and political science at the Newark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents. He's on MS Now, political commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. His newest book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, was published in 2025. Beinert has also written for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Newsweek, and others. Please welcome our guest, Peter Beinert.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for making the trip down from New York and being here with us today. We're looking forward to a good conversation and lots of engagement from the audience today. I wanted to start off by asking you, you dedicated this book to your grandmother. And you pronounce her name, Adele? Pinar, of blessed memory. And you say that she disagreed with the arguments of this book. And I noted that you didn't say but, you said and, her spirit is on every page. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell us about your grandmother and the struggle that writing this book represents for you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question, actually. I don't think I've been asked that question since the book came out, and it's a privilege to get to talk about my grandmother. I also just want to say thank you to all of you having me. And I wanted to say at the outset that this is a very controversial subject, certainly in my own community, in the Jewish community, but in America at large, the question of Israel and Palestine and American policy. And I always hope when I look out at the crowd that there are people who've come who disagree with me, because I feel like so often in the United States and in the Jewish community, people only go to listen to those with whom they already agree. So if you're somebody here who disagrees with some of the things that I'm about to say, I just want to say how grateful I am that you're here. It says in the Talmud, it says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." And I always feel like the person who's traveled the furthest ideological distance to listen to someone with whom they disagree is showing the greatest degree of wisdom. And my grandmother and I did disagree very deeply. Her life experience was very different than mine. Like many Jews of her generation, her life was shaped by the kind of destruction and collapse of Jewish communities in different places. It was a bit of a different story than your typical Jewish American story, which probably would have had Jews fleeing Eastern Europe either early 20th century or before or after the Holocaust. She was actually, her family was from the Isle of Rhodes and Izmir in what was then the Ottoman Empire, now Greece and Turkey. And then she was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and then moved to the Belgian Congo, of all places, which had a small Sephardi Jewish community, and then to Cape Town, South Africa. But still there was this sense of dislocation of these Jewish communities that she'd been a part of that had ceased to exist. And she would tell me all the time that I should never be too comfortable in the United States, that there was no place in the world that Jews could really permanently feel at home except for in the state of Israel. And that had a very profound impact on me. And it was only as I got older that I began to rethink some of the ideas that I learned from her and from my parents. And it was a painful reconsideration. Some ways not so different than having to learn things about one's own family that are painful and maybe somewhat hidden truths, while still trying to retain that sense of loyalty and love, solidarity that one has with one's family, even while recognizing that that terrible things have taken place. And so I guess what I meant by her spirit was, one of the things I wanted to write to show in this book, or try to show in this book, is that believing that Palestinians have the right to freedom, that Palestinians should be treated equally alongside Israeli Jews, does not reflect a lack of deep solidarity with other Jews, does not reflect a lack of concern for Jewish safety. To the contrary, this is my best effort to make an argument of what I think actually is required for Jewish safety, because I think Jewish and Palestinian safety are ultimately intertwined. And a system of terrible and brutal oppression of Palestinians ultimately, I think, makes everybody less safe. That's not the way my grandmother saw things, but I wanted to try to find ways in the book of showing that that a support for the rights of Palestinians doesn't mean that those of us who believe that are any less committed to our own people.
Thank you. Let's go right at it. I mean, I think you, unlike many in the Jewish community, really are speaking in favor not of a two-state solution, but of a single state. Perhaps, I think in your book you talk about maybe even being renamed and so forth, but the idea that there can be safety for Jews alongside Palestinians with full rights. The reading I've done and the people I've talked to, that's a very complicated endeavor. Involving the right of return, for example, of so many Palestinians that would overwhelm the numbers of Jews, for example, is one example. Tell us how you came to that conclusion, which does kind of fly in the face of, I think, what is the more established consensus within the Jewish community. I shouldn't even use the word consensus, but dominant position, we should say.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think the consensus is fraying, particularly among younger people, but this definitely has been the dominant view and is the dominant view of the most powerful American Jewish institutions. I guess I would start by saying that to me, I'm less interested in how many states there are, whether it's one state, which is really what exists today, or whether there's a partition in two states. What matters more to me is the principles on which those states are based. I guess for me, my foundational belief is that all human beings are created equal in the image of God. In fact, in Torah, which is the word we use for the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is the word that Jews tend to use for the Old Testament, the Jewish story, the Israelite story, is not what begins Torah, right? You have a whole series of people who we encounter at the beginning of Torah Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the generation of Noah, the generation of the Tower of Babel. None of those people, according to Jewish tradition, are Jews or proto-Jews or proto-Israelites at all. They're universal human beings. And the rabbinic tradition says that the point of this is to show the inherent value of all human beings, irrespective of their race, religion, ethnicity, because these are people who essentially are before the world has even been divided into those categories, right? And so for me, if all human beings are created equal in the image of God, the political corollary should be that people should be treated equally in the eyes of the law, irrespective of their ethnicity or religion or race. We have had a long struggle over that principle in the United States, and it is very much ongoing today. And one of the things that I think I only began to grapple with later in life, that I really didn't grapple with given the community in which I was raised, was how I could support that principle in the United States of equality under the law, regardless of one's religion, ethnicity, or race, and yet not support that principle in Israel-Palestine. To me, it seems it's a universal principle, and one either supports it everywhere or one doesn't actually really support it at all. If you make an exception, you say, well, it's a great principle for everybody else, but for us, because we as Jews are a small group and we've had this really, really painful history, for us, we have to accept the idea that we will have superior legal rights, a kind of system of legal supremacy over Palestinians. So one of the problems with making that exception, it seems to me, is that a lot of other people want to make that exception as well. And one of the really disturbing things that we see in the United States and in Europe is that a lot of people, a lot of ethno-nationalist forces in some ways want to make their countries more like Israel. If you think about what Donald Trump wants for the United States, what does he want when he says, make America great again? He wants a country with some kind of clear legal hierarchies in which everybody knows who's on top and who's not on top, right? That white, straight, Christian men are on top, and then other people are kind of slotted in below, right? Like the way they imagine what things were like in the 1950s, right? And so if I oppose that, it seems to me I also must be opposed to that principle in Israel-Palestine as well. I think that the irony of saying that Jews need a system of legal supremacy to be safe is that Israel is actually the least safe place to be Jewish of any large Jewish community in the world. The Jewish communities around the world, in the United States, in Canada, Australia, France, Britain, I don't want to say there isn't anti-Semitism, there is, those things worry us. But actually we are safer than Jews are in Israel, even though we're small minorities. And I don't think that's an accident, actually. I think that systems that are based on equality under the law, even though they can be messy and dysfunctional, have lots of problems, are actually safer for everybody. Because systems of legal supremacy impose a lot of violence on the people who were made legal inferiors. Think about all the violence that was imposed on Black Americans before Black Americans got the right to vote. A lot of it was hidden from white Americans, but it was a system of ongoing violence, right? And that violence produces counter-violence, and I think ultimately makes people less safe. People are safer when everyone has the right to be heard by government and represented in government, because then you have a non-violent path to get the government to listen to you, and you're much less likely to take up arms. And that's why I believe, even though my views would be considered quite radical among Israeli Jews, and also remain in the minority among American Jews, although I think this is starting to change, I actually think that if you ask Palestinians what would make Israeli Jews safer, they have a deep understanding. It's just as if you would have asked Black Americans what would make white Americans safer. They understand the connection between safety for everyone and their freedom. And that's what I believe is the best path towards for a future in Israel-Palestine. Again, whether it's in one equal state or whether it's in two equal states. Because even if you create a Palestinian and a Jewish state, even if there's partition, Israeli Jews in both of those states are still going to have mixed populations. There's still going to be Jews and Palestinians living alongside one another, even if there were two states. So I would still want those Jews and Palestinians who were neighbors to be treated equally under the law.
Thank you. I received one of many respectful and clear letters of concern from a neighbor to the church in the advent of your coming. And this neighbor who's Jewish said, look, Peter Beinart is very wise. He's very articulate. He's also a really nice person. She said, a fact that she knows through some personal connection. Yet she wrote to me, he represents a fringe position within the broader Jewish intellectual community, and audiences who hear him risk walking away believing they have received a balanced or representative picture of the situation in Israel, when in fact they will have encountered one of its most ardent outlier critics. I'm curious not only how you would respond to our neighbor, but also how would you want non-Jews to understand your own position within the broader Jewish community, particularly for those of us who are doing our best not to fan the flames of anti-Semitism and wish to support our Jewish neighbors and friends?
I really appreciate that. First of all, I would absolutely encourage you to listen to voices that are different than mine. I'll even, and you could have them come to the church. I'll give you some suggestions, because I actually spend a lot of time listening. I mean, first of all, most of the people that I go to shul with, that I pray with every Saturday, actually hold views probably much more like this neighbor, and in fact, even in my own family. So these are views that surround me all the time. And if you want to hear thoughtful, articulated, well-informed people who have a different point of view, I would suggest you read in English. One person I would point you to is an Israeli writer named Haviv Rettig Gur, slightly long name, but the last name is G-U-R. I think Haviv Rettig Gur makes the best version of a case that is not convincing to me. Yair Rosenberg, who happens to be someone I actually go to shul with, who writes in The Atlantic, also will offer you a quite different perspective. Yossi Klein Halevi, another Israeli writer who does that. There are plenty of folks, and I would absolutely listen to them. Although I also think it's important to listen to Palestinians who don't have as much of a voice in this conversation often as we Jews do. I guess the first thing I would say is I don't think just empirically that my views are as fringe as this person is suggesting. There was a Washington Post poll that came out last year that showed that 39% of American Jews think Israel has committed genocide in Gaza versus 51% who think it hasn't. So that suggests a pretty profound split. We know about 1/3 of Jews in New York City voted, according to the exit polls, for Zoran Mamdani, who's someone who is anti-Zionist. The term Zionist is complicated, right? Many American Jews will claim the term, but oftentimes, depending on how you define it, you get very different answers. So there was a fascinating poll, for instance, which asked American Jews whether they would consider themselves Zionists based on different definitions. So if you said, are you a Zionist if it means a connection to the land of Israel? People said overwhelmingly yes. And they said, are you a Zionist if it means you support a Jewish and democratic state? And people said yes. But when the question was, do you consider yourself a Zionist if Zionism means that Jews have superior rights to Palestinians? Overwhelmingly, American Jews said no. So a lot of this has to do with how you perceive realities on the ground in Israel-Palestine. We know also there's a massive generational gulf among American Jews, as there is among Americans as a whole. So literally, some of the most prominent American Jewish leaders who hold my views to be anathema have children whose views are much closer to mine. But even beyond all of that, I would argue that the truth of a proposition is not based on how much public support it has, right? I mean, we can imagine points of view on the question of segregation in the United States or of slavery in the United States, right, in which the position of human equality might have been at certain moments in history considered a really radical, outlandish, and marginal position. So to me, ultimately, what really matters is what are the principles that we believe in? And then how do we build from those principles towards ideas about what we think policy should be and the way states should be governed? And so I think that on the question of anti-Semitism, there's a lot more one could say about this. But I think fundamentally, anti-Semitism is a form of bigotry. And bigotry has to do with hatred or discrimination against a group of people because of their race, religion, ethnicity, right? Suggesting that Jews and Palestinians should be treated equally is not bigotry. Equality is not bigotry, it's the antithesis of bigotry, right? And so there is, it seems to me something somewhat perverse to suggest that it is anti-Semitic It is not anti-Semitic to say that Jews should be treated equally with Palestinians, right? It is anti-Semitic to say that Jews should be treated as legal inferiors, right? But that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting a position of legal equality. And I think that while it's very, very important to listen to Jews and to understand the fears that exist within our community, which are very real and come out of a deep history of pain, you also have a fundamental responsibility to your own conscience, right, on this question, as on any question around the world, right? And unfortunately, and this is, I think, a tremendous tragedy, the debate about anti-Semitism has to a significant degree been hijacked by the interests of the state of Israel, a state that wants to find ways of inoculating itself against criticism, and therefore uses, and unfortunately often in conjunction with powerful American Jewish organizations, uses claims of anti-Semitism in order to prevent people from actually offering legitimate critiques of the way the state behaves and of its political system. And every state should be subject to criticism, right? To say it's anti-Semitic to question the political system of Israel is like saying it's Islamophobic to question the political system of Iran or Saudi Arabia, or that it's an anti-Asian bigotry to question the political system of the People's Republic of China, right? Or that it's anti-black racism to question a military dictatorship in Nigeria or Kenya. It's a category mistake, right? The fact that these states are populated by people of a particular racial or religious or ethnic group doesn't mean that questioning their policies or even questioning their political system means that you are bigoted against people of that racial, religious, or ethnic group. And that's, I think, the fundamental problem with the way in which anti-Semitism is often deployed. And I will say, and then I'll stop because I'm going on too long, it makes me very, very upset, actually, to see the way in which good and decent people who see things on their screens about what Israel is doing to Palestinians, right? Israel has been classified as an apartheid state by even its own leading human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din. It has been accused of genocide now by its own leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, in addition to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and the International Association of Genocide Scholars. It has killed 100,000 people, according to the best estimates we have in Gaza, when Gaza only has 2.2 million people. That's 5% of the population. That's a percentage which is 40 times the number that Russia has killed in Ukraine. Gaza has more child amputees than any place on earth, even though it's a tiny place. If you see that and you think it's wrong and you want to speak out about it, that is not something that you should be ashamed of. That is the same act of human solidarity and care that led people to fight against slavery and Jim Crow and Vietnam and apartheid. That is the best spirit that we've had historically in the United States. And the fact that you may not have a personal connection to that place, that you're not Jewish or you haven't been there, in some ways it makes it to me even more impressive that people who don't have a personal connection, just because of a basic understanding of human solidarity. I quote in my book Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of my heroes. Heschel was a Polish chassid. He grew up speaking Yiddish. He could not have been culturally further from Vietnam than almost any place on earth. And yet he was so tormented by the pictures he saw from Vietnam that he literally said he could not open the prayer book and pray because he saw images of burning flesh from napalm in Vietnam. It's that kind of human solidarity that I think actually is always required for great moral movements for freedom and equality. And if you're someone who feels that way and want to act on it, I think actually, to my mind, you're acting in the best spirit of Judaism, the principle of the idea that all human beings are incalculably valuable. And it, to me, is deeply, deeply upsetting to see people like that be smeared as anti-Semitic.
That's a lot to absorb. Thank you. Several things I want to ask you about, and I'm not sure which to ask first. I mean, I think in some ways we could be critiqued for not starting with Palestinian suffering in this conversation.
Yes.
And the incredible numbers that you've named, and I know that the numbers themselves, you even talk about that in your book, become a political
Yes.
way of evasion almost to
Yes.
deal with the
Yes.
reality of suffering. I'm wondering about the deeper connections between state violence in
Yeah.
all places and the promises that governments make in the name of state violence. It will bring about this, it will bring about that, and so
Yes.
forth.
Yes.
Those can, and you brought up Abraham Joshua Heschel,
Yeah.
and I think about the co-conspiracy, as it were, of Heschel and Dr. King and the
Yes.
Civil Rights Movement,
Yes.
and the way in which they saw so clearly
Yes.
so much earlier. And in fact, as you point out, both were critiqued for, there were those within the Civil Rights Movement who said to Dr. King, why are you preaching out against the war? Like,
Yes.
we need to stay focused on this struggle.
Yes.
And that quote that we all know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, it lives, I think,
Yes.
in the conscience of those of us who want to do right, do good, and oppose violence in all of its forms. Can you say a little more about the place of violence and nonviolence in your approach, not
Yeah.
only to Israel-Palestine, but just to liberalism, to world community in general?
That's a great question. I mean, states are inherently violent, right? States have police forces, right? They have militaries. So violence exists and will always be part of the world until some messianic future, right? It seems to me that the important question is that violence bounded by law, right? Is that violence constrained by law, by a democratic practice in which people have the right, in which those who have guns are subject to the will of the people, and also are they subject to the rule of law, or can they act based can they act without being constrained by the rule of law? So if you think about, say, the United States before the Civil Rights Movement, what you had was that violence vis-a-vis white people by the state was constrained to a significant degree, right? It was constrained because white people had the right to vote, right? So the policeman who could use violence against you, right, had to know at some level that there could be repercussions if that person harmed them. Because that person, you could say, I'm going to get you fired. I'm going to write a letter. I'm going to vote out the mayor who hired you. These things, right? That doesn't make things perfect, but black Americans didn't have that capacity in the South because they didn't have the right to vote. Or in apartheid South Africa, for instance. Or Catholics didn't have that in Northern Ireland, right? Because they weren't represented in government in Northern Ireland. That's the problem in Israel-Palestine, right? It's not that Israeli soldiers, again, and I, like many, many Jewish people, I know kids from my son's and daughter's high school who've gone to serve in the Israeli military. I know lots of Israeli friends and family who have kids that serve in the military. It's not that those are bad young people who they send into the West Bank or Gaza, right? They're just kids, right? The problem is when they're interacting with Palestinians, their violence is not constrained by law or by democratic principle. Because Palestinians in the West Bank are subjects of the State of Israel, but are not citizens. They don't have the right to vote. They live under military law, even as their Jewish neighbors live under civil law with due process, right? So it means that the state is not accountable to them. It has impunity. So if the state wants to inflict harm on them, right, humiliate them, take their land, throw them in jail without due process, the prosecution rate for Palestinians in the West Bank is 99% conviction rate. You can be held indefinitely without trial, or even take their lives. That violence is not constrained and they're defenseless. That is a terrifying way to live. And if you go to the West Bank, you'll see that. Similarly in Gaza, again, where we still don't even have, Israel is still not even allowed international journalists into Gaza after all of these years, right? And you have no capacity to make the state of Israel accountable for what it's done to you through legal mechanisms, because people in Gaza also, although the state of Israel has life and death power over them, they are not citizens of that state. They cannot vote for that government, right? And so that to me is the problem of violence. Now then there's also the question of counter-violence. How do we think about counter-violence, right? I believe that nonviolence is the most ethical form of resistance, right? It is the highest and most valuable form of resistance. But it's not enough to simply say that people should practice nonviolence. You have to actually support their nonviolence, because when nonviolence doesn't succeed, right, people are much more likely to take up arms, right? We think about Nelson Mandela today in South Africa. Sometimes he's imagined as this apostle of nonviolence. He was not. Nelson Mandela was involved in turning the African National Congress towards armed struggle. And if you look at the statements he made in the 1960s, he said, we've been trying nonviolence and it has not worked. It has not worked, it's not getting us anywhere, right? So I think what Hamas did on October 7th was a series of war crimes, right? It is fundamentally wrong to target civilians, no matter what your grievance, right? If you are occupied under international law, you do have the right to use violence against soldiers, right? Look at Ukraine. We are actually giving the Ukrainians weapons to fight against Russian soldiers who are occupying Ukraine. But it would be fundamentally wrong for Ukrainians to use those weapons against Russian civilians. I would love a scenario in which Palestinians did not even use arms against Israeli soldiers. God forbid, I don't want Israeli soldiers to die. But if we want to move towards, if we want that, we have to support Palestinian efforts at nonviolence. And look at what happens when Palestinians use nonviolence, right? In 2018, there was this thing called the Great March of Return, where Palestinians marched largely nonviolently to the fence that separates Gaza from Israel. Right? Did people applaud and said, oh yeah, great, you're turning to nonviolence, this is what we want, this is what we've been calling on? No. Israel put sharpshooters on the fence and shot systematically with drones and sharpshooters those people who were marching largely nonviolently. Mostly they were shot in the knee and below. So many people were crippled that Gaza, after that, created an amputee soccer team. You know what it's like to be an amputee in Gaza, where you can't get decent medical care, where you don't even have consistent electricity? What hell that was for those people, right? That empowered Hamas and made October 7th more likely. Palestinians have been proposing a boycott and divestment and sanctions movement, right? That movement is based on the anti-apartheid movement and is explicitly nonviolent, right? It says we don't want Israelis to die, but we do want them to feel it in their pocketbooks, and for them not to be able to participate in international soccer competitions and not get as much investment. Exactly that hopefully will lead to a change where we move towards our freedom, right? The more one opposes Palestinian violence against civilians, the more it seems to me one has an obligation to support Palestinian nonviolence. But look at what the United States government does. When Palestinians try to go to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice or the United Nations, we literally impose sanctions on the judges and prosecutors of these international bodies when Palestinians try to use nonviolent processes of international law, right? It's not only immoral, it actually makes Israelis less safe, because it convinces Palestinians that these are all a failure. They'll get you nowhere. And it leads Palestinians to be more likely to do the kinds of things, including the horrible things that happened on October 7th.
So do you think that the BDS movement then is an effective tool that you would want to see supporters of peace implement? Because that's one of the things that I think we're often told is not welcome for those who wish to be friends to the Jewish community.
I would just say it's very painful to me to hear the way these things are framed, to be a friend of the Jewish community, right? It seems to, because I actually believe that the people who are most likely, we do live in an era of rising anti-Semitism in the United States. Anti-Semitism is rising in tandem with Islamophobia, anti-LGBT bigotry, nativism, they're all rising together because they rise as liberal democracy falls. They rise because we have in power people who are white Christian male supremacists, and everybody who falls outside that category is now like in the crosshairs and being seen as some kind of other, right? Not truly fully American, kind of like a guest here. Okay if you're on your best behavior, but you better not challenge the people who are the real Americans, right?
Amen to that.
And I will say that the people who I trust the most deeply to protect Jews against the bigotries that are coming at us are the people who believe in the principle of human equality and the people who will fight for everybody. Because I believe ultimately all of our safety is intertwined, right? And that includes Palestinians. That includes Palestinians. So when I see people who are fighting, who believe who are fighting for freedom and equality of Palestinians, I don't see those people as people who are not friends to Jews. I think of those people who have a moral conviction that ultimately means that we are more likely to be able to rely on them. Look at what's happening to the American right now, right? All of these people who claim, first of all, so many of these people on the American right who claim to be such big supporters of Israel also often were feeding anti-Semitism, right?
That's true.
And oftentimes it's because their view was like, yeah, great, Jews are great when they live in Israel, their country, but if they live in America, which is our country, right, a white Christian country, right, they better not get in our way, right? So all of which is a preamble to the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. I'm not saying, right, that the boycott, divestment, sanction movement has lots of different campaigns, basically. They say, like, you should boycott this university should disinvest in this. I'm not saying you should surrender your critical faculties. Look particularly at what they are asking to boycott it. I think there are times when the BDS movement has made mistakes. It's not infallible. For instance, they wanted to boycott this movie, No Other Land, because it was made with an Israeli and Palestinian director. It's actually an incredibly powerful film, which shows what Israel was doing in the West Bank. I think it was very foolish to say that that should be boycotted, right? But to go back to the basic principle, right? If we believe there's something fundamentally wrong, right, in the way people are being treated, and we believe in the principle of nonviolence, I think your predisposition should be sympathetic to a nonviolent movement which is speaking in the language of human rights and international law. Again, I don't say this because I want Israelis to suffer economically, because I want Israelis to not be able to be in soccer competitions and music competitions, or because I want Israeli academics to suffer. I know many Israeli academics, but unfortunately, in supremacist political systems, people don't generally wake up one morning and realize that the system is wrong and needs to be changed. I wish that happened, right? But I think if you look at the American South, and you look at South Africa, and you look at Northern Ireland, these systems only change when they meet enough resistance that they stop working for the people who are on top, the people who are benefiting for them, right? I also wish we hadn't had ICE doing that it took what they did in Minneapolis to stop doing what I wish Donald Trump and Stephen Miller had woken up one morning and thought, oh my God, what am I doing? Right? But it was only the resistance that we saw in Minneapolis that ultimately began maybe to stop this a little bit. So it takes resistance, and I don't want the resistance to be in blood, right? And so that is why, as a general principle, I am sympathetic to these calls for boycotts and divestments and sanctions. And I don't think there is anything anti-Semitic about it, right? Any more than it was anti-Afrikaner to be involved in a boycott when South Africa was committing apartheid, or whether it was anti-white Southerners to support boycotts that happened during the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, the American Jewish community itself has used boycotts. In the 1970s, when the Soviet Union was not allowing Jews to emigrate, the American Jewish community organized to boycott the Bolshoi Ballet and all kinds of other Russian enterprises because it was a means of putting pressure in pursuit of freedom.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question, then maybe we can shift to some questions from the audience. But I think this relates to the tension that I feel as a Christian in listening to a lot of what you're saying and in wishing to be in support of justice for everyone involved. For the longest time in interfaith conversations, one of the things that we kind of establish in dialogue is recognizing kind of when it's not my place, when it's my place to observe a boundary between telling someone who's in a different religion from yours what you think they ought to believe or think. And I would say in my more formative years, I thought of Zionism as one of those things.
Yes.
And to your point earlier, Zionism, first of all,
Right.
a lot of people use it pejoratively
Yes.
and don't understand the deep differences and different forms of Zionism,
yeah.
so it gets all sort of flattened.
Yeah.
But what I hear you writing about
Yeah.
in this book is saying that as a Jew within your faith, this is something that is indefensible as it's being articulated, and it's indefensible as it's being lived out currently. What would you say to those of us who are trying our best not to, particularly as Christians, how many Christians are there in the world? Like 2.4 billion Christians, and I think you point out in the book, the number of Jews in the world is still smaller than it was prior to the Holocaust. How can we be respectful of the boundaries around telling a minority faith, minority people what it is they should believe, particularly as it relates to the place of the land within their faith, while also standing for these democratic ideals and the rule of law and other things that I think you've pointed out? We can't pick and choose when we stand up for those things.
Yeah, so I would say a couple things. I mean, I think first of all, I understand the impulse to want to be in solidarity with Jews, to be respectful of Jews. I'm very grateful to live in a country where so many Christians feel that way. That hasn't always been the Jewish experience, in majority Christian countries. Thank God we live in a country with people who are concerned about that. The difficulty for people like you is that not all Jews agree, right? So it would be easier if we all agreed, right? But actually we're a pretty disputatious group. There are lots of Jewish jokes. There's a Jewish joke about the guy who goes to a desert island. He builds 2 synagogues. And they say, why 2? One that he prays in, one that he would never step foot in, right? So and actually these divisions are only growing wider. In fact, certainly outside the Orthodox community, in most Jewish families today in the United States, there are very deep and often bitter divisions over this question. So it means in some ways that it makes things harder, right? Because being in solidarity with what some Jewish people are saying want you to do is going to mean that you're in strong opposition to others, which means ultimately in some ways you have to listen to everybody. And you should listen as much as possible, but you ultimately have to come back to your own conscience. Now, on questions of theology, I would agree. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for Christians to say, this separating of milk and meat thing doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I mean, let's put that aside, right? Every religion has its own weird theologies and customs, and I think we should be allowed to pursue those. But when it comes to public policy, right, I wouldn't opine on the way Christians interpret the Bible. But if a church or a pastor then interprets the Bible in such a way that they then go and lobby for public policies that, for instance, seem to me to mean that LGBT people are not treated fairly, I would say I oppose the public policy positions that you support, right? And so I think that that's a legitimate position to take. I don't think, I think that the centrality of the idea of Israel in Judaism is a very recent phenomenon, right? And to my mind, it's very strange theologically, right? Again, because if you look at, in terms of my reading of Torah and of the Hebrew Bible, it is very clear that people are not supposed to worship states, right? In fact, we recently just observed the holiday of Passover, right? And one of the things that the rabbis do is they try to understand the figure of Pharaoh and why Pharaoh was such a bad guy. And one of the things the rabbis say, the rabbinic commentators say, is that Pharaoh's tyranny was connected to the fact that Pharaoh thought of himself as a god, right? Pharaoh's tyranny was connected to his idolatry. So in fact, you find that in the prophetic books, the Jewish kings are required to write a Sefer Torah, write a book of law, to show that they are not above the law, that they are subject to law, right? And so it seems to me that, in fact, when the great Orthodox Israeli social critic Yeshayahu Leibovich was asked this question, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? And his answer from a Jewish theological perspective was absolutely not. No state has a right to exist. Human beings have a right to exist because human beings are created in the image of God. States are mere instruments for the protection of human life and human dignity. They have conditional value, but never unconditional value. That the state must be judged in relationship to the lives of the people who live within the state. And if the state, rather than protecting the lives of its people, is destroying the lives of people, then you have a fundamental obligation to reimagine the nature of that state. Just as the United States did when it abolished slavery and when it overcame segregation, and in which in some ways we still need to do in various ways today, right? So again, to me, that's why saying that the test of being a good Jew or the test of being in solidarity with Jews is your belief in the unconditional right to exist of this state as it is formed now, it seems to me, as I think about it, is a very un-Jewish idea.
Interesting. You know, you were asking me earlier about Presbyterianism, and within our faith tradition, the concern about idolatry is often centralized.
Yes.
Which I always joke, you know, you can obviously see, since we have one of the largest collections of Tiffany stained glass windows in the world, you can see that we both fear it and practice it at the same time. These are questions from the audience. Much non-Jewish support for Zionism is based on Islamophobia. Can you discuss the lack of discourse on Islamophobia compared to anti-Semitism?
Yes, I think that's a really great question. There is a very serious problem of anti-Semitism in the United States, but the problem of Islamophobia, I think, is much, much greater. And you can see that in the fact that we have prominent American politicians, right, who speak about Muslims in a way that no politicians speak about Jews, right? I mean, Donald Trump has, said, I think in 2016, he said, Islam hates us, right? We have many Republican politicians who say that, America is menaced by Sharia law, right? We don't have, thank God, American politicians say America is menaced by halakha, by Jewish law, even though halakha and Sharia are actually quite similar, right? And if you wanted to delve into it, just like I'm sure you can find Muslims who use Sharia courts to deal with business disputes or to deal with family disputes, believe me, in New York City and in Baltimore, you could find exactly the same things happening with Beit Din, Jewish religious courts practicing halakha all the time. We have mosques that when people try to build mosques, there's huge political opposition from local politicians. Thank God we don't have that nearly as much when it comes to synagogues. So I think that we need to talk a lot more about Islamophobia, and we also have to recognize, the public opinion, the polling that I've shown shows that one of the best predictors of whether one will have anti-Semitic views is whether they have Islamophobic views, right? Again, because it both tends to come from this basic idea that both of these groups are basically outsiders, anathema to what America's core identity is, which is as a white Christian country. So I think it's a really important question.
It is interesting. You reminded me, we had this program at the church during our Advent season, which is sort of preparation for the Christmas season. And we invited a Muslim imam, a friend of mine, to come and talk about Muslim views of Jesus 1 week. And another week we had a rabbi come and speak about Messianism from a Jewish perspective. It was really very rich. But I remember the week the rabbi was here, as I was saying thank you to him, I just said thank you so much, and we've been praying for your community. We understand that anti-Semitism has been on the rise and so forth, and basically, like, we're with you in human solidarity. And then the next week I said the same thing to the imam. Like, we understand Islamophobia is very much on the rise, as a result of what's happening in the world and so forth. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, why didn't you also say anti-Semitism was on the rise? And I said, wow, it's so interesting that these two things are often pitted against each other as if they're in competition with each other, as opposed to we should be opposing any kind of bigotry, as you named it earlier, whenever it happens, whenever it occurs.
Yes, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but the truth is actually, theologically, historically, Jews have had more trouble theologically with Christianity than with Islam, because Islam is very, kind of austerely monotheistic, right? Whereas Jews have had historically, theologically, problems with the idea of the Trinity, much more significant than any theological problem Jews have had with Islam. So if you look at Jewish religious commentators, I don't know of any religious commentator who said there's a problem with a Jew going into a mosque. But there have been Jewish religious commentators historically who've had a problem going into churches. I think it's wrong. I don't think there's any problem with going to church, but because of the idea of the Trinity. So again, it's just a historical artifact that we have this moment, that we at this point have this idea that somehow Jews and Muslims should be, and Jews have not always fared well in Muslim majority societies. But I would say, if you look at the broad sweep, actually, that there's been certainly less genocidal violence against Jews in Muslim lands than there was in Christian Europe.
For your interest, I do remember that this church, I think it was like in the 1890s, invited a rabbi to preach. And the church was immediately accused of heresy within the presbytery. But also in the African American newspaper, the Afro wrote, that's great and all that Brown Memorial had a rabbi, how about inviting a black preacher to the congregation? So a few years later, that was reported in the paper. So these struggles, can be seen as intertwined and should be seen as mutually supportive.
Absolutely.
Here's another question from the audience. How can interfaith coalitions effectively mobilize to support the people of Israel and Palestine?
I think the first most important thing to do is, as we said earlier, is to listen to people who are from there, who live there, right? Again, I would encourage you to listen to Jewish Israelis. Not all Jewish Israelis agree, but the truth, but overwhelmingly, Jewish Israelis have a perspective that is very different than mine. The truth of the matter is that even if Benjamin Netanyahu loses the election that's coming up, the people who are running against him don't see the Palestinian question that differently. I think that's, for my mind, tragic, and I think that their policies are deeply immoral, but I would encourage you to listen. But also, it's so important to listen to Palestinians. And it's particularly listen to Palestinians because they're less represented in American media than Israeli Jews are. So, and if you have the good fortune to go and listen to Israeli Jews. Go meet with Israeli settlers in the West Bank. I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. Listen to anyone you can, but especially listen and go and see what Palestinian life is like. I think even for many, many Jews, it's a transformative experience to actually go and see and meet people who've lived their entire lives without basic human rights. Again, I've been going to Israel since I was a kid, and yet I had never, until my early 30s, gone and spent time with Palestinians in the West Bank. And on the first day, I began to feel like the world was kind of shaking underneath me because of the enormity of what I felt like I was experiencing. The only equivalent I could imagine in America would be like what it would have been to like go to Mississippi in the first half of the 20th century, you know? That would be the first thing. And then I think after that process, then I think the question we should all ask as Americans is, how do we want our tax dollars to be used, right? How do we want our every American, religious, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, everything, right? We pay these tax dollars, and the question is, if we're giving Israel, roughly, what basically America does is it gives Israel a prepaid credit card every year of about $3.5 billion that Israel can then use to buy American weapons, right? So it's money that the taxpayers give Israel gets weapons, and then our defense contractors get our tax dollars, right? And the question is, and again, given that Israel is now, according to the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and some of Israel's most prominent genocide scholars, like Omar Bartov, has committed genocide, could we be using that money better, right? Are there things that could do more good in our country or in the world? And I think there are, and I think it is absolutely legitimate for you to be engaged in that debate.
This is a question that I think invites some more, sort of the intersection between your personal struggle and your public self. And it says in Christian spaces, it's been lonely and traumatic to speak out on genocide early before many were writing. How have you navigated this in your own faith community? And I would add just in your life, the tension that you must deal with in that.
Well, I think the first thing which is important to say is that whatever difficulties it comes with taking an unpopular view in a community, the difficulties that I face don't involve risk to my life. They don't involve me not having enough food to eat or roof over my head, right? And those and those are the situations that many people around the world, and certainly Palestinians, face every day. So the problems I have are really trivial compared to the problems that a lot of people have. And even in the United States, compared to a lot of other critics of of Israel, it's easier for me. I'm Jewish, which makes it easier. I also present in a certain way, which makes it easier. I also have tenure at a university, which makes it easier. Thank God. So what I face is a sense that I'm not always the most popular guy in the room, in the Jewish spaces that I've, spent my adult life in and where my kids were raised. And that's hard sometimes, but I think for me, the way I think I've tried to respond to it in a couple of ways. The first is just a life principle to try to remember always that I'm not responsible for what other people do and how they act. I'm responsible for how I behave, right? So if other people want to end their friendships with me because of my political views, they have the right to do that. I can't make someone want to remain my friend. But I'm not going to cut off relationships with family and friends because of people's political views, right? And the second is that if people are telling me in some form or another that I'm not a good Jew because I oppose what the state of Israel is doing, the most important thing for me to be able to answer is to myself in terms of my relationship to Judaism. So I think it's not entirely coincidental that in 2020, which is the year where I publicly wrote a series of essays arguing for the idea of equality under the law rather than the principle of Jewish supremacy, I also began a practice which is called daf yomi, which means in Aramaic a page a day. So there is a tradition that if you study a page of Talmud a day, it's actually a folio, it's both sides of the page, that you finish the Talmud in 7.5 years. And so I began in 2020. That was when this newest cycle of the daf yomi starts, and we'll finish next summer. And I don't want to claim that studying Talmud every day, that reading the Talmud is like reading like the Bernie Sanders campaign literature, right? That like everything is like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I believe. This is a text written 1,500 years ago. Right. A lot of it is just like really bizarre. And sometimes a moral perspective that I struggle to even understand. But it does remind me, it roots me in the realization that I am part of something which is much, much older, much deeper, much, much bigger than the political debates about the state of Israel today. That it's my relationship to those texts that make me, for me, that's what it means for me to be a Jew. And I think these texts are what has sustained us as a people for a very long time and will, irrespective of what happens with the state of Israel. So I'd say that's how I deal with those questions. And then last point I'd make is that I have been incredibly blessed to see the incredible proliferation of new communities that are led by young Jews who basically want to have committed, joyous, meaningful Jewish lives in a way that they believe is consistent with the principle of Palestinian freedom. And although I don't think it's quite fully understood yet in terms of the media, there's an explosion of a kind of Jewish religious renewal built around communities based on the idea of Palestinian freedom. Just in New York City alone, in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been at least maybe a dozen what we call minyanim, like Jewish prayer communities that have emerged based on this principle. So there's really something happening, and I'm privileged to get to be part of some of that.
Wow, thank you for that. I hope you'll write on some of what you've learned from spending that much time in the Talmud too. This one relates to what you just said about kind of new voices emerging and with a different approach. Can the current dominant Jewish establishment organization, it's singular, I might make it plural, in the U.S. be reformed on Israel and Palestine, or is this a lost cause?
I think, unfortunately, what will be required is new institutions. The institutions, the most influential American Jewish institutions, and I'll just name them, AIPAC, for instance, or the Anti-Defamation League. I think these organizations, first of all, are beholden to, they're just not mass membership organizations. They're not democratically organized organizations. They're organizations that are really beholden to large donors. I'll never forget an experience years ago. I was invited to go speak at the Jewish Community Center in Atlanta. And after I was invited, the invitation was rescinded, and the person told me that there was a community outcry. And I said, well, and then they found another venue at a non-Jewish space, I think at a church actually. And I said, well, since I'm going to be in Atlanta anyway, maybe I could talk to some of the people who didn't want me to speak, because, you know, I'm not unfamiliar with right-wing Jews, like there's many of my best friends, so and family. And what happened was a lunch was set up for me with one person. And this was the emissary of the person who basically happens to be one of the founders of Home Depot, who basically funds almost everything in Jewish Atlanta. And this is so in some ways, what I'm saying is the problem we have in the American Jewish community is a microcosm of what's happened in America as a whole, which is this massive rise of income inequality has meant that many communal institutions are actually led by people not who have any particular expertise, deep understanding of Judaism, but simply have the resources, because so many of the resources have gone to the people at the very top. And people who have that kind of wealth are more likely to have a certain set of perspectives. There was a time when American Jewish organizations used to actually be concerned with questions of economic justice, right? But they're not likely to be when they're basically funded by billionaires. And so I think you need different kinds of institutions that are based on the principle of the idea of the centrality of liberal democracy. Because, and I mentioned this in the book, one of the things that frightens me the most, and what I think is most tragic, is not just that these American Jewish organizations are promoting policies vis-a-vis Israel that I think are immoral, but that because the way they look at, because the question they ask of politicians is, do you unconditionally support Israel? It means that they are willing to support politicians who are openly authoritarian as long as they take the right position on Israel, right? That's the question they ask about, that's what question they ask about Donald Trump. Not will he allow us to have a free election in this country, but does he unconditionally support Israel? Which means that they are not allies of the struggle for liberal democracy in the United States. In the mid-20th century, the American Jewish organizations, their central focus was actually in supporting the civil rights movement, because they understood that if Black Americans got equal treatment, that American Jews would also benefit as a small, historically oppressed minority. And so they played an important role. The American Jewish Congress actually at one point had more lawyers working on civil rights than either the Justice Department or the NAACP. It was a point of great pride. The person who spoke before Martin Luther King at the March on Washington was the president of the American Jewish Congress. He was he had been a rabbi in Nazi-held Berlin, and he spoke about the importance of standing up for people and not being silent. Those Jewish organizations now have become something completely different. They've become Israel defense organizations, and they would be happier with an authoritarian American government that supported Israel unconditionally than American democracy that actually changed its policy. And that, to me, is actually one of the things that makes me most upset about this moment. About the fact that these organizations are complicit in authoritarianism, in the rise of authoritarianism, and I think it's why we need a new set of institutions.
Thank you. This question asks, I think this is asking you to have a crystal ball, but I'm sure you can handle it. Would Iran have shown the same restraint in the use of nuclear weapons against Israel if it had had nuclear capability over the past 50 years like Israel?
That's a very good question. First of all, I appreciate that the question acknowledges something that's often not acknowledged in the American public discourse, which is that Israel has nuclear weapons, right? Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It may get them, it may want them, but it does not have nuclear weapons now. Iran is also a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? Israel has probably a couple hundred nuclear weapons, and it's not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's no oversight or inspections at all. Again, so it seems to me, I actually think when we talk about the question of Iranian nuclear weapons, we should talk about it in tandem with the question of Israeli nuclear weapons, right? Part of the reason that it's important to acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons is I think it actually can put in perspective some of the fears that we have about Iranian nuclear weapons. I don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. I would much rather there be fewer countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. I think the Iran nuclear deal that Obama negotiated was good because it actually did make it certainly for a significant period of time meant that Iran would not get nuclear weapons. But I don't believe that even if Iran did have nuclear weapons, again, I don't want them to, I don't believe they would pose an existential threat to Israel for the same reason that the Soviet Union did not pose an existential to the United States when it had thousands of nuclear weapons. That Israel has a very strong nuclear deterrent, right? Israel has nuclear weapons not just on land but also on submarines, right? It has the same kind of deterrent that we had and still have today against Russia, against China, against North Korea, against other countries that have nuclear weapons. I think Iran, if you go back to we have a long history now of looking at how Iran has behaved since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. What have we seen? We've seen a government that is very brutal towards its own people, right? Very brutal towards its own people. But we see a government that says, death to Israel, death to the United States. But as I read Iranian foreign policy, you do not see a government that has been willing to risk its own survival in order to try to destroy the state of Israel or to go to war against the United States. It's actually been fairly cautious in the way it's dealt with both Israel and the United States. We saw this in the last summer during the 12-day war. Iran barely retaliated. Iran has basically was up until this most recent war, doing its best to stay out of a conflict with Israel and Iran. And one of the points that I often cite to people is that there is two factors about Iran. The first thing, which is striking to know, is that Iran actually still has the largest Jewish community in the Middle East outside of Israel, right? And those Jews are not free because nobody in Iran is free. But Iran has working synagogues, it has kosher butchers, it has Jewish day schools, right? Again, I don't want to romanticize. The Iranians are a terrible regime. But when people say Iran is genocidally anti-Semitic, I say, and they compare them to the Nazis, I say, well, did you have still working synagogues and Jewish day schools and kosher butchers in Iran, 40, 50, in North Nazi Germany 40 or 50 years after Hitler? If this was a genocidally anti-Semitic regime, it would be trivially easy for them to start with the Jews in Iran, right? And they have not. The second point is that Israel armed Iran in the 1980s, after the Islamic Revolution. It wasn't just that Israel had a good relationship with the Shah, who was overturned. Israel in the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq were at war, Israel was more, at that point, afraid of Saddam Hussein's Iraq than it was Iran. And if you remember the Iran-Contra affair, Israel actually pushed the United States to arm Iranians because Israel was not at all concerned about the Iranian threat, even in the 1980s under Ayatollah Khomeini, the first line, when Iran was actually saying all of these same things about death to Israel that's saying today. So again, even Israel itself in its history has an understanding that it has understood Iran as, in its foreign policy, a kind of normal power, right? Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership only started describing Iran as an existential threat after Iraq was basically destroyed and Iran began to fill the power vacuum. That language of Iran as an existential threat did not begin when the Islamic Revolution took place. It began because of a geopolitical change in which, because the United States had so destroyed Iraq, that Iran grew more powerful in response.
We're kind of moving all over the place
Yeah,
now. But,
that's okay.
how can Stephen Miller prosecute a program against people of color while his administration coddles, frankly, anti-Semitic hate groups?
Let me tell you a story. My parents are South African. So one of the things that I learned growing up was a point of great pride was that in 1964, at the famous Rivonia trial, when Nelson Mandela was on trial, that all of the white defendants who sat next to him in the dock were Jews. And South African Jews like to talk about that today. Those were some of my heroes growing up, those people. The prosecutor was Jewish as well. He was a man named Percy Utar. He was actually the president of one of Johannesburg's largest Orthodox synagogues. He was the Attorney General of the Transvaal, the province that encompasses Johannesburg. Percy Utar was a brilliant lawyer. He encountered a lot of anti-Semitism in the Afrikaner political establishment, but he showed that he was loyal to the state, loyal to the apartheid regime, and he believed very strongly that Jews had a lot to be grateful for in apartheid South Africa. Jews were considered white in apartheid South Africa, and that Jews should be grateful, and Jews should respond by protecting the state against its enemies, in this case, the African National Congress. So Percy Utar had a different interpretation of Jewish history and a different interpretation of Jewish self-interest. And I think Stephen Miller is in some ways a kind of America's version of Percy Utar, right? He has an understanding of what it means to be Jewish, I think. I mean, I don't know him personally. But I think in which he sees allying with white Christian supremacy as the best way of protecting Jews and allowing Jews to flourish in the United States. I think it's fundamentally immoral. I think it's a desecration of Jewish history and all the times in Jewish history where we wanted people to care about our fortune when we were considered the legal inferiors. But I also just think it's profoundly stupid. I think it's profoundly stupid because people who are anti-black, anti-trans, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant bigots will get around to Jews sooner or later. In fact, if you listen to Nick Fuentes, some of you may know, is kind of like this kind of tribune of this kind of young, youthful, kind of basically virtually kind of neo-Nazi sentiment. What Fuentes says is, why is everyone giving me such a hard time about anti-Semitism? Nobody in the Republican Party was upset when I used the N-word about black people. No one is upset when I say things about Muslims. And now you're saying I can't be anti-Semitic? If you look at these bigotries are intertwined. They travel together. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018, which was the worst violent attack on Jews in American history, the guy who attacked that synagogue did not start out focused on Jews. He was radicalized by watching Fox News and other people talk about the migrant invasion coming from Central America, right? But the thing about anti-Semitism is that the stereotype of Jews is different than the stereotype of black and brown people. It's of kind of Jews as like the sinister genius. And people who are racist and think that black and brown people can't organize themselves sometimes tend to think that the Jews are behind it, right? So people said the Jewish communists were running the civil rights movement because they didn't think black people could organize their own freedom struggle. And so this guy didn't think that people in Central America could organize their own caravans to invade the United States. And so he decided that George Soros was behind it. And then he saw that the synagogue down the block was organizing a refugee Shabbat, and so he attacked the synagogue. This is the way these things interplay with one another, and it's why I think Stephen Miller's understanding of Jewish safety, let alone the question of morality. And I would, by the way, very highly encourage you to Google the essay that was written years ago by Stephen Miller's uncle, in which he told the history of their own family story and asked the question, what would have happened to our family had people like Stephen Miller been in charge of the United States when we were coming to the United States? But putting aside that moral question, I think from the perspective of Jewish safety, it's profoundly misguided.
This person wrote that they'd learned a lot by watching Simone Zimmerman in Israelism and her podcast Beyond Israelism. Do your views about Zionism differ in significant ways from hers?
No, not particularly. Simone is an old friend of mine. We used to work together. I think the film is a very valuable film, if you haven't seen it, which kind of talks about the process in which young American Jews like Simone, who's a little bit younger than me, but had an upbringing that wasn't that different than mine, kind of are taught an understanding of Judaism that makes them kind of that makes them feel like supporting whatever Israel does is their responsibility as a Jew, and then the way she came to question this by encountering Palestinians. So no, I think that Simone and I generally see things the same way.
This person said, your comments on the cycle of violence reminds me of John F. Kennedy's observation with regards to Central America that if you make reform impossible, you will make revolution inevitable. There's not a question there, but I do recall from your book that you spend quite a bit of time speaking about people who are radicalized toward violence. And how, the current situation in Gaza with so many killed and so many maimed, you're imagining the number of young people who are being radicalized as we speak. And the same could be true of any who are victims of oppression anywhere in the world. But do you resonate with that comment? And what do you make of that? Yeah, I mean, one of the things I mentioned in my book is that some of the current leaders, if you look at the biographies of some of the current leaders of people who were leaders of Hamas and also of Islamic Jihad, which is kind of the smaller Islamist organization that was also involved in October 7th, you see that they have in their family histories stories of Israeli violence, right, against Palestinians. Because just let me say, it's important to understand what Gaza is, right, and how Gaza came to be. Gaza was the area behind Egyptian lines where Palestinians who were expelled from their homes or fled in fear fled to or expelled to in 1948. Roughly 3/4 of the people from Gaza are not from Gaza. They're people who were expelled from what is now Israel. Some of them live so close to the lands from which they were expelled, they can actually literally see those lands in Gaza, right? And Israel has been going in and invading Gaza, going in militarily into Gaza since the early 1950s. Why is that? Because Hamas was only created in 1987. So long before Hamas existed, Israel has been going in militarily and attacking into Gaza. Why? Because from the very beginning, those Palestinians were trying to return. Many of them were literally just trying to go back to the fields and farm their fields or see what had happened to their homes. And some began to take up arms as well. And so Israel, for decades, going back to the early 1950s, Israel has been attacking in response to what they see as these terrorist attacks coming from Gaza. Some of the leaders of Hamas and Islamic Jihad saw their parents killed in 1956 when Israel went into Gaza and killed hundreds of people in a massacre in Gaza. So from the perspective of the safety of Israeli Jews, you think, what is the consequence now, right, of having killed perhaps 100,000 people, right? It makes me terrified, frankly, just from the perspective of the safety of Israeli Jews. Put aside the question of the horror of what's happened to Palestinians. When I think about all of those people who've grown up and seen dozens of their family members killed and seen their people starving to death around them without basic medical care, right, with terrible injuries, right, what kind of politics do we think those people are likely to produce? Right? Is it likely to be a politics? You think you're going to get something more moderate than Hamas as a result of this? When Israel went into Israel's now also attacking southern Lebanon, right? Israel's also been attacking Lebanon literally almost since the late 1940s, early 1950s for the same reason, because a lot of other Palestinians were expelled to southern Lebanon, and then they tried to come back, and then Israel has been attacking Lebanon ever since. In the early 1980s, Israel launched a huge invasion of Lebanon, right, to try to force the PLO out, right? Because at that point, Israel couldn't imagine anything more dangerous than the PLO and Yasser Arafat. And they did force the PLO. The PLO left Lebanon and went to Tunisia. And what did Israel get in response? It got Hezbollah. Hezbollah emerged in response to that Israeli invasion, right? So this, it seems to me, is the dynamic that's being produced. And the only way, it seems to me, to change that dynamic is to give Palestinians a hope that there is a path towards their freedom that comes through acting in accordance with international law, right? And through nonviolence and actions that are in accordance with international law. And Israel and the United States government have been doing exactly the opposite. I think we're almost at time, and I wonder if you would leave us with, I was really I read a book cover to cover. So when you, in your acknowledgments, you talk about your family and particularly your kids and kind of what they have to deal with as being children of you. And I wonder, as you dream about the future or think about the kind of relationships in the land that you can anticipate are possible and real, what are your hopes for the future? What are your hopes for the Jews in your family and friends who disagree with you, and for the Palestinians that you've gotten to know by face and name who are suffering under this ongoing occupation?
I mean, one of the things that is a theme in Black American writing and also in Black South African writing is the idea that systems of supremacy don't only take a toll on the people who are the victims of supremacy, the legal inferiors, but they take a toll on the people who are benefiting from a supremacy. That there's a kind of soul sickness that comes from being part and complicit in supremacy, and that there's a kind of liberation that actually can be experienced when the burden of being part of a supremacist system is lifted from you. I see that kind of soul sickness in the Jewish community, in people who I see who in so many aspects of their lives have such tremendous empathy and decency and intellectual curiosity, and then on this subject it's like a wall goes up and separates people from their best selves. And so what would I want? I mean, every weekday morning, because Jewish men don't lay tefillin on Shabbat, but every morning I wake up and I put on tefillin, which is the way Jewish men pray in the morning, and some Jewish women, in more progressive environments. And my son, who's in college, who doesn't put on tefillin every morning and knows that I wish he would, but we all, kids don't always do what you want. He called me the other day and he said, he said, I put on tefillin today. He said, don't get too excited. I'm not, but I just felt like I should put on tefillin. And it reminded me of a picture I have of my grandfather laying tefillin at the Kotel, at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And so what I think that my vision of what I would want at a personal level would be, that one day that my son, Ezra, his kids, and my daughter Naomi, in the way that she prays as well, that Ezra could lay tefillin at the Kotel in an Israel-Palestine in which everyone was equal, in which everyone was free, in which his deep love and connection to that place, that land, wasn't coming, and his joy in being there wasn't coming at the expense of Palestinians, and that he might be able to experience a kind of liberation that could mean that he could have a Jewish experience that he can't have now, right? That in some ways our spiritual lives are limited by this system of oppression, and that in some ways Judaism itself and the Kotel itself, the last remaining wall of the temple that was destroyed 2,000 years ago, that all of these could be elevated by them being in a place where the Palestinians who are living alongside of us could be truly free. So that would be my vision.
Well, Peter Beinart, thank you so much for being with us today, for your scholarship and work.
Thank you.